Hello everyone. Welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we bring you 7 deeply disturbing, true Alaskan small-town horror stories that will make you question what really happens when civilization ends and the wilderness begins. These are not fictional tales, but real encounters shared by people who lived in places where help is hours or days away, and where the isolation can break even the strongest minds. Each story has been meticulously documented through first-hand accounts, witness testimonials, and verified records from communities scattered across America's last frontier. Alaska holds secrets that most people will never understand, and perhaps it is better that way. The vastness of the land, the months of darkness, and the complete isolation create conditions where the unthinkable becomes reality. If you enjoy authentic horror content rooted in true events that will keep you awake at night, subscribe to Buried Files and hit the notification bell so you never miss our latest investigations into the darkest corners of human experience. After you listen to these chilling accounts, we want to hear from you in the comments below about your own encounters or knowledge of remote communities where strange things occur. Now settle in as we explore what happens when people are truly alone in the frozen darkness of small-town Alaska. Samuel was a 45-year-old mechanic who had lived in the remote Alaskan village of Kivalina his entire life. The population never exceeded 200 souls, and everyone knew everyone else's business. The village sat on a narrow barrier island, surrounded by the Chukchi Sea on one side and a lagoon on the other, with the nearest road system over 60 miles away across frozen tundra. Before the spring thaw of 2018, Samuel needed to get this story documented because he wanted people to understand how isolation and the long darkness of Arctic winters can transform a man into something unrecognizable, and how a community's trust can be weaponized against the innocent. Samuel had grown up in Kivalina, learning his trade from his father, who had learned it from his grandfather. In a village where equipment breakdowns could mean life or death during the brutal winters, a good mechanic was worth his weight in gold. Samuel fixed snowmobiles, generators, boat motors, and anything else with an engine. He was the kind of man people called at 2 in the morning when their heating system failed and temperatures dropped to 40 below zero. He had never married. Content with his work and his standing in the community, his small house near the edge of the village was cluttered with tools and spare parts. But it was his sanctuary. He knew every family in Kivalina, had fixed their machines, had shared meals with them, had mourned their losses and celebrated their victories. In October of 2017, a man named Marcus arrived on the weekly bush plane from Kotzebue. He was in his early 30s, white, with a rough beard and hands that looked like they had seen hard work. Marcus had been hired by the fish processing cooperative that operated during the summer months but needed year-round maintenance. The cooperative had tried to hire locally for years, but most young people left for larger towns, and those who stayed had other obligations. Marcus came with references from processing plants in the Bering Sea Islands, and he seemed eager for the work despite the isolation. The cooperative manager, a man named Robert who was Samuel's cousin, vouched for Marcus and helped him settle into one of the small apartments above the cooperative building. Samuel met Marcus at the village store 3 days after his arrival. It was already dark by 4 in the afternoon, and the temperature had dropped below zero. Marcus was struggling with a stubborn door on one of the cooperative's utility vehicles, his breath coming out in white clouds as he swore at the frozen metal. Samuel approached and offered his help. Within minutes, he had the door working again, explaining to Marcus the tricks of keeping machinery operational in Arctic conditions. Marcus was grateful and bought Samuel coffee at the store. They talked for an hour, and Samuel found himself liking the newcomer. Marcus asked good questions about surviving the winter, about the community, about the land. He seemed respectful and genuinely interested in making Kivalina his home. Over the next weeks, Samuel and Marcus developed a friendship. Samuel taught Marcus how to properly winterize equipment, how to keep generators running during blizzards, how to dress in layers and watch for frostbite. Marcus helped Samuel with jobs that required 2 sets of hands, and he proved to be a quick learner. Samuel introduced him around the village, and Marcus made an effort to attend community gatherings and learn basic phrases in Inupiaq. By November, when the sun disappeared below the horizon for the long polar night, Marcus seemed like he was becoming part of the fabric of Kivalina. But then, strange things began to happen. Small items started disappearing from homes around the village. A carving knife from one house, a necklace from another, a box of ammunition, a satellite phone. Nothing of enormous value, but personal items that people noticed missing. In a community as small and tight-knit as Kivalina, theft was almost unheard of. Doors were rarely locked. People trusted one another because they had to. Survival in such a harsh environment demanded cooperation and mutual support. The thefts created an atmosphere of suspicion and unease that was foreign to the village. Samuel first heard about the missing items at a community meeting in late November. The darkness outside was absolute, and the wind howled against the community center walls. Various people stood up to report what had been taken from their homes. The elders looked troubled. In the old days, they said, such behavior would have been dealt with swiftly because a person who stole from the community endangered everyone. Robert, the cooperative manager, suggested they organize a village watch and make sure everyone secured their belongings more carefully. There was general agreement, but Samuel could see the worry in people's faces. Something had changed in Kivalina, and no one knew how to fix it. Marcus attended that meeting, sitting quietly in the back. Samuel noticed him taking notes, which seemed odd. But he thought perhaps Marcus wanted to volunteer for the watch rotation. After the meeting, Marcus approached Samuel and expressed his concern about the thefts. He said he hoped the village would catch whoever was responsible because it made him uncomfortable knowing there was a thief among them. Samuel agreed, though he found something slightly off about Marcus's tone. He could not quite identify what bothered him, so he dismissed it as his own paranoia brought on by the situation. December arrived, and the thefts continued despite the village watch. More items disappeared, and the tension in Kivalina grew thicker. People began locking their doors for the first time in years. Neighbors who had been friends for decades looked at each other with suspicion. The darkness and the cold seemed to press in harder, and Samuel noticed that people were not gathering as much in the evenings. The social fabric of the village was fraying, and he felt powerless to stop it. Then, in mid-December, everything changed for Samuel. He returned home one evening after working on a generator at the school to find Robert and 2 other village council members waiting outside his house. The temperature was 30 below, and their faces were grim. Robert explained that several people had come forward with concerns about Samuel. They had noticed him near their homes around the times when items went missing. One person claimed to have seen Samuel acting suspiciously near a window. Another said Samuel had been asking unusual questions about what people kept in their homes. The evidence was circumstantial but troubling, and the council needed to search Samuel's house and workshop. Samuel stood in the frozen darkness, too shocked to speak. These were people he had known his entire life. People whose equipment he had fixed countless times, whose children he had helped, whose trust he thought was unshakable. He tried to explain that he often walked around the village at odd hours because he was frequently called out for emergency repairs. but he could see the doubt in their eyes. The long darkness and the stress of the thefts had created an atmosphere where reason was overwhelmed by fear and suspicion. He had no choice but to allow the search. They found nothing in his house, but in his workshop, tucked in a toolbox he rarely used, they discovered several of the missing items: the carving knife, the necklace, the ammunition. Samuel stared at the items in disbelief. He had never seen them before. He tried to explain that someone must have planted them, but his protests sounded weak even to his own ears. Why would anyone frame him? What motive could there be? The council members looked at him with a mixture of disappointment and anger. Robert, his own cousin, turned away without meeting his eyes. They confiscated the stolen items and told Samuel he was to remain in his house except for essential travel while they decided what to do. In a village with no police force and no easy way to contact outside authorities during the winter, justice was handled internally. Samuel spent the next days in a kind of hell. He could not eat or sleep. He ran through every interaction he had with people in the village, trying to understand how this had happened. He thought about Marcus, about how the newcomer had taken such an interest in Samuel's routines and work schedule. He remembered Marcus asking about different homes, about who lived where, about the layout of the village. At the time, it had seemed like normal curiosity from someone trying to learn his new community. Now, those questions took on a darker significance. On the third day of his confinement, during a brief period when the wind died down, Samuel decided he had to investigate. If he was going to clear his name, he would have to find evidence himself. He waited until late evening, when most people were in their homes, and made his way to the cooperative building where Marcus lived. The temperature had dropped to 40 below, and the ice fog that sometimes formed in extreme cold hung in the air, reducing visibility to a few feet. Samuel reached the building without being seen and quietly climbed the exterior stairs to Marcus's apartment. The door was locked, but Samuel had helped install the locks when the apartments were renovated years ago. He knew their weaknesses. Using a thin piece of metal from his pocket, he manipulated the mechanism and eased the door open. Inside, the apartment was warm and dimly lit by a single lamp. Marcus was not home, probably working late at the processing plant. Samuel moved quickly, searching through drawers and closets with the practiced efficiency of someone who knew how to find things in cluttered spaces. In the bedroom closet, beneath a loose floorboard, Samuel found a backpack. Inside were more of the missing items from around the village: tools, jewelry, personal papers, photographs. There was also a laptop computer, which seemed out of place among the other items. Samuel opened it and found it was not password protected. What he discovered made his blood run cold despite the warm air in the apartment. Marcus had files documenting his time in Kivalina and in other remote villages across Alaska and northern Canada. He had a pattern. He would arrive in an isolated community, establish himself as a trustworthy member, then begin a systematic campaign of theft and psychological manipulation. But the thefts were not about the value of the items. They were about creating chaos and distrust. Marcus kept detailed notes about the social structures of each community, about who trusted whom, about the fault lines that could be exploited. In Kivalina, he had identified Samuel as the perfect scapegoat because of his access to homes, his solitary nature, and his position of trust. There were photographs of other villages, other victims who had been framed for Marcus's thefts. Some of the notes suggested that Marcus had successfully destroyed the social cohesion of entire communities, turning neighbor against neighbor until the villages essentially ceased to function. He documented it all with a clinical detachment that was profoundly disturbing. There were also references to criminal charges he had fled in the lower 48 states, to restraining orders and accusations of stalking. Marcus was a predator who had found that remote Alaskan villages provided perfect hunting grounds because they were isolated, because they had limited law enforcement, and because the people were trusting by necessity. Samuel photographed everything with his phone, his hands shaking with a mixture of fear and rage. He replaced the backpack exactly as he had found it and left the apartment, making sure to lock the door behind him. Outside, the cold hit him like a physical blow, but he barely noticed. He went directly to Robert's house and knocked on the door until his cousin answered. In Robert's warm kitchen, with Robert's wife and teenage son present as witnesses, Samuel showed them what he had found. He watched Robert's face change as he scrolled through the photographs on Samuel's phone, watched the realization dawn that they had been manipulated by someone who understood exactly how to exploit their trust and their isolation. Robert immediately called an emergency council meeting, and within an hour, most of the village leadership was gathered. The decision was made to confront Marcus immediately. They could not risk him discovering that Samuel had found the evidence and fleeing on the next plane. A group of men, including Samuel and Robert, went to the processing plant where Marcus was working the night shift. When they entered, Marcus looked up from the equipment he was servicing and immediately understood that something had changed. He tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. The building was surrounded by men who knew the village intimately, and outside there was only frozen darkness and deadly cold. They brought Marcus to the community center and showed him the evidence. At first he denied everything, but faced with the photographs and the testimony of Samuel, his denials became less convincing. Finally, as the night wore on and the entire village gathered to hear what had happened, Marcus's facade cracked. He admitted to the thefts and to framing Samuel, but he showed no remorse. Instead, he launched into a bitter tirade about how naive and trusting the people of Kivalina were, how easy it had been to manipulate them, how their isolation made them perfect victims. His words were chilling in their coldness and contempt. The village council contacted the Alaska State Troopers via satellite phone, but the nearest detachment was in Kotzebue, and weather conditions made it impossible for them to fly out for at least a week. The council decided to hold Marcus in a secured room in the community center with constant guard until law enforcement could arrive. Samuel was publicly cleared of all suspicion, but the damage to the community had been done. The trust that had bound Kivalina together had been fractured, and repairing it would take time. When the troopers finally arrived and took Marcus into custody, the village learned more about his past. He had outstanding warrants in Washington and Oregon. He had been banned from entering several Alaska Native villages. The cooperative had failed to conduct a thorough background check, relying instead on falsified references. Marcus was eventually convicted on multiple charges and sentenced to prison, but the sentence seemed inadequate for the psychological damage he had inflicted on multiple communities. Samuel never forgot that winter. The experience of being falsely accused by people he had known his entire life, of having his trust and reputation shattered, left scars that did not heal easily. He continued his work as a mechanic, and eventually the people of Kivalina rebuilt their relationships with each other and with him. But something had changed in the village. Doors stayed locked now. People were more cautious about newcomers. The innocence of their isolation had been permanently compromised by Marcus's calculated cruelty. Samuel often thought about the other villages Marcus had destroyed and wondered if they had recovered or if the damage was permanent. He learned that isolation could be a weakness as well as a strength, and that trust, once broken, was the hardest thing in the world to repair. In the long darkness of the Arctic winter, he learned that the coldest thing in Alaska was not the temperature, but the capacity of some people for casual destruction of everything good in the world. This all occurred 3 winters ago, when Arya was working as a seasonal employee at a remote hunting lodge, accessible only by bush plane. To give background, Arya was a 28-year-old from Washington State who had taken the job to escape problems back home and experience true Alaskan wilderness. She had gone through a difficult divorce and needed distance from everything familiar. The advertisement for the position had promised adventure, good pay, and the kind of solitude that could help a person reset their life. What it did not mention was that isolation could become a prison, and that being cut off from civilization meant being cut off from help. The lodge was called Denali Ridge Outfitters, though it was nowhere near Denali. It sat at mile 147 on a defunct mining road that had not been maintained in decades. The road was impassable for most of the year, eroded by permafrost heave and reclaimed by wilderness. The only reliable access was by float plane in summer or ski plane in winter. The lodge catered to wealthy hunters who paid premium prices for guided expeditions after moose, caribou, and the occasional grizzly bear. During the peak season from August through October, the place employed a dozen guides, cooks, and support staff. But in the off-season, only a skeleton crew remained to maintain the property and prepare for the next year. Arya arrived in late October, just as the last of the hunting clients departed and the lakes were beginning to freeze. The owner, a man named Gerald Hutchins, picked her up himself in his Super Cub. Gerald was in his early 60s, weathered and lean, with the confident manner of someone who had spent decades in the wilderness. He had built the lodge with his own hands 30 years earlier and had a reputation as one of the best hunting guides in the state. During the flight, he pointed out landmarks and told stories about successful hunts and close encounters with wildlife. Arya found him charming and knowledgeable, exactly the kind of Alaskan character she had hoped to meet. The lodge itself was impressive. A massive log structure with soaring ceilings and trophy mounts covering the walls. There was a commercial kitchen, a great room with a stone fireplace, and individual guest cabins scattered around the main building. Solar panels and a diesel generator provided power, and water came from a well. For the winter, the staff would consist of just 4 people. There was Gerald, Arya, and 2 men named Tom and Steve who handled maintenance and firewood. Tom and Steve lived in a cabin about a quarter mile from the main lodge, while Arya had a small room in the staff wing of the main building. Gerald had his own quarters on the opposite side. The first weeks went smoothly. Arya's job involved deep cleaning the guest cabins, organizing supplies, updating the booking system, and helping prepare meals. Tom and Steve were friendly, but kept to themselves mostly, working long days cutting and splitting firewood for the winter. Gerald was an attentive employer, making sure Arya had everything she needed and teaching her about the systems that kept the lodge running. He shared meals with the staff and told stories about his years in Alaska, about close calls with bears, about rescuing stranded hunters, about the challenges of building a business in such a remote location. But Arya began to notice things that made her uncomfortable. Gerald paid particular attention to her during meals, asking personal questions about her divorce and her reasons for leaving Washington. At first, she thought he was just being friendly, making conversation to break up the monotony of winter. But his questions became more probing, more focused on her emotional vulnerabilities. He asked about her relationship with her ex-husband, about whether she was lonely, about what she was looking for in Alaska. She tried to deflect with vague answers, but Gerald seemed to take her reluctance as a challenge. He also began finding reasons for them to work together on projects. he needed help inventorying the trophy room. He wanted her opinion on rearranging the furniture in the great room. He asked her to assist him with maintaining the generator, claiming he wanted her to know how everything worked in case of emergency. During these times, he would stand closer than necessary, would touch her arm or shoulder when making a point, would hold eye contact just a fraction too long. Arya recognized the pattern from her marriage, the gradual erosion of boundaries disguised as mentorship or friendship. In early November, Tom and Steve flew out to Fairbanks for supplies and to visit family before winter fully set in. They would be gone for 10 days. Gerald assured Arya that this was routine, that they always made a supply run in early winter, and that she and Gerald could easily manage the lodge together. But once the plane disappeared over the horizon, Arya felt a knot of anxiety in her stomach. She was alone with Gerald in a place that was unreachable by road, where the radio was the only connection to the outside world, where the nearest neighbor was over 50 miles away. The first night alone, Gerald opened a bottle of expensive whiskey and invited Arya to join him by the fire. She declined politely, saying she was tired from the day's work. He did not press, but she saw something flicker across his face, a momentary tightness around his eyes. She went to her room and locked the door, something she had not bothered with before. She lay awake for hours, listening to the sounds of the lodge settling and the wind outside. The next morning, Gerald's demeanor had changed. He was not overtly hostile, but the friendly charm had evaporated. He spoke to her in clipped sentences, giving orders rather than making requests. When she asked about the planned tasks for the day, he told her they would be working on winterizing the guest cabins together. They spent the day going from cabin to cabin, draining pipes and shutting off water, and Gerald used the time to tell her stories. But these stories were different from before. They were about hunters who had violated game laws, about men who had gotten away with things in the wilderness that would have landed them in prison elsewhere. He talked about how Alaska was the last place where a person could truly live by their own rules, where the weakness of civilization did not apply. One story in particular chilled Arya. Gerald described a hunter who had accidentally shot and killed another member of his party. According to Gerald, the man had simply buried the body in a remote location and reported that his companion had wandered off and gotten lost. No body was ever found, no charges were filed, and the man continued hunting in Alaska for years afterward. Gerald told this story with a casual tone that suggested he admired the hunter's ruthlessness. Arya asked if the story was true, and Gerald smiled and said that in Alaska, truth was whatever you could make people believe. That night, Arya tried to use the satellite phone to call her sister in Seattle, but she found that the phone was not working. She checked the equipment and discovered that the battery had been removed. She went to Gerald's office to ask about it, and he told her that he had removed the battery to preserve its life for emergencies. He would reinstall it if she needed to make a call, but he wanted to know who she was calling and why. The implication was clear. Her communication with the outside world was now subject to his permission. Arya realized she was in serious danger. She considered her options carefully. Tom and Steve would not return for another 8 days. Even if she could get the radio working, calling for help would mean admitting her suspicions, which were based on implications and uncomfortable feelings rather than overt threats. And if she was wrong, if Gerald was simply socially awkward and she was overreacting due to trauma from her divorce, she would lose her job and her reputation in the small world of Alaskan wilderness lodges. But her instincts, honed by years of navigating a controlling marriage, told her that Gerald was testing her, pushing boundaries to see what he could get away with. She began to prepare. She packed a small emergency bag with warm clothes, food, and the few survival supplies she could access without raising suspicion. She studied the maps in Gerald's office when he was outside, noting the locations of the nearest communities and airstrips. She tested the radio late one night and confirmed it was working, which meant her only reliable communication was under Gerald's control. She also began noticing things around the lodge that she had missed before. There were locks on the outside of some of the storage rooms. There were restraints in one of the equipment sheds, which Gerald had claimed were for handling injured animals, but which seemed excessive for that purpose. And she found, hidden in a filing cabinet, a folder containing photographs of previous female employees, women whose expressions in the photos ranged from uncomfortable to frightened. On the 5th night alone with Gerald, he came to her room. It was late, past midnight, and Arya was not asleep. She heard his footsteps in the hallway, heard him pause outside her door. The handle turned slowly, testing the lock. She had pushed a chair under the handle as an additional barrier, and she heard Gerald's quiet curse when the door would not open. He knocked softly and asked if she was awake. She did not answer, controlling her breathing, pretending sleep. After a long moment, she heard him walk away. The next morning, Gerald was angry. He accused her of being ungrateful for the opportunity he had given her, of being cold and unfriendly, of not appreciating the hospitality he had shown. His voice rose as he spoke, and Arya saw the mask fully slip. This was not a lonely man, awkwardly seeking companionship. This was a predator who felt entitled to what he wanted and was furious at being denied. She apologized, trying to defuse the situation, but her words seemed to enrage him further. He slammed his hand on the table and told her that she was in his lodge, in his world, and that she needed to understand how things worked out here. Arya made a decision. She told Gerald she needed to check on something in one of the guest cabins and left the main lodge. Once outside, she went directly to the equipment shed and gathered supplies. She took a radio, a flare gun, extra batteries, and a heavy coat. She knew that if she stayed, the situation would escalate. Gerald's behavior suggested that he had done this before, that the photographs in the filing cabinet represented a pattern, and that her isolation was not accidental, but engineered. She considered trying to walk out, to follow the old mining road toward the highway 50 miles away. But it was November in Alaska, with temperatures dropping well below zero at night and limited daylight. She would not survive the journey on foot, especially not with Gerald likely to pursue her in his snowmobile. Her only real option was to reach the radio and call for help, then find a place to hide until help arrived. She went to one of the farthest guest cabins, one she knew had a wood stove and adequate supplies. She barricaded herself inside and used the portable radio to call for help. She reached a flight service in Fairbanks and explained her situation, trying to sound calm and rational despite her fear. The dispatcher took her seriously and promised to send someone as soon as weather permitted. But there was a storm system moving in, and flights to the lodge might be impossible for several days. Arya would have to wait. Gerald discovered her absence within an hour. She heard his snowmobile moving around the property, heard him calling her name. His tone shifted from concerned to angry to threatening. He knew she had taken the radio. He shouted that she was being foolish, that she would freeze if she tried to run, that he owned every building on the property and she had nowhere to go. She stayed silent in her cabin, keeping the stove fire low so the smoke would not give away her location. The standoff lasted 3 days. Arya rationed her food and kept the cabin warm enough to survive, but not comfortable. She heard Gerald moving around periodically, heard him trying different cabins. On the second day, Tom and Steve returned early from Fairbanks, brought back by the flight service dispatcher who had called them. They confronted Gerald, and Aria heard the argument from her hiding place. Tom and Steve had known Gerald for years, but had never seen this side of him. They had heard rumors about previous employees leaving suddenly, but Gerald had always claimed they could not handle the isolation. Now, faced with evidence of his predatory behavior, they were shocked and angry. The pilot who brought Tom and Steve stayed at the lodge, both to evacuate Aria and to serve as a witness. When Aria finally emerged from the cabin, she was exhausted but relieved. Gerald tried to claim she was mentally unstable, that the isolation had affected her judgment. But the pilot and the returning staff did not believe him. They had seen too many red flags, and Tom admitted he had always felt uneasy about Gerald's interactions with female employees. Aria left on the next flight out. She filed a report with the Alaska State Troopers. But the case was complicated by the remote location and the lack of physical evidence of assault. Gerald had been careful, never crossing certain lines, always maintaining plausible deniability. The investigation revealed that at least 4 previous female employees had left suddenly under similar circumstances, but none had filed formal complaints. Gerald lost his business eventually. Not from legal consequences, but from reputation damage. Word spread in the small world of Alaskan hunting lodges, and clients stopped booking with him. Aria moved back to Washington State, but kept in touch with Tom and Steve. They told her that Gerald had sold the lodge and disappeared, possibly to another remote area, where he could start over with a new identity and new victims. That knowledge haunted her. She had escaped, but others might not be so fortunate. The isolation that had attracted her to Alaska, the promise of escaping her problems and finding peace in wilderness solitude, had nearly destroyed her. She learned that isolation was a double-edged sword, that the absence of civilization meant the absence of protection, and that predators understood this better than anyone. Until this day, she does not know if Gerald had actually harmed previous employees or if she had been the first to resist him successfully. The uncertainty, the knowledge that she had been completely vulnerable and that help was days away, changed how she saw the world. She was no longer the person who believed that running away could solve problems. She had learned that some dangers follow you, and others wait for you in the places you run to, patient and calculating. It started in October 2019, when David was a junior at the small high school in Haines, a town of 800 people squeezed between the mountains and the sea in southeast Alaska. David had lived in Haines his entire life and knew every road, trail, and shortcut in the area. He was comfortable in the wilderness, having grown up hunting and fishing with his father and uncles. The darkness and the isolation of Alaska in winter did not bother him. He had driven the same route home from school hundreds of times, down the Haines Highway and then onto Cripple Creek Road, a narrow gravel track that led to his family's property 3 miles outside of town. The road cut through dense spruce and hemlock forest, with mountains rising steeply on one side and a creek running parallel on the other. During the school year, David often made the drive in darkness, and he had never felt afraid. That changed on a Tuesday evening in mid-October. David left school around 6 after staying late for basketball practice. It was already dark, and a light rain was falling, typical for southeast Alaska in autumn. The highway was empty, and David had his music playing as he drove. When he turned onto Cripple Creek Road, his headlights cutting through the darkness and mist, he was thinking about homework and an upcoming game. He He was not paying particular attention to his surroundings until something massive crossed the road ahead. David slammed on his brakes, his truck skidding slightly on the wet gravel. Whatever had crossed was enormous, much larger than a moose or bear. It had moved with a strange gait, not quite like any animal David was familiar with. He sat in his truck, engine running, staring at the spot where the thing had disappeared into the trees. His first thought was that it must have been a moose, that the darkness and rain had distorted his perception of its size and movement. But moose were common in the area, and David had seen hundreds of them. This had been different. He continued home slowly, scanning the forest on both sides of the road. His heart was beating faster than normal, and he felt an unfamiliar sensation of unease. When he reached home, he did not mention the incident to his parents, partly because he was not sure what he had seen, and partly because he did not want them to think he was being foolish. He went to bed that night, but had trouble sleeping, his mind replaying the moment when the thing had crossed in front of his headlights. 3 nights later, David saw it again. This time, he was ready, or thought he was. He was driving home from a friend's house around 10 at night. As he navigated the curves of Cripple Creek Road, his headlights caught something standing at the edge of the tree line. David slowed the truck and got a better look. The creature was standing upright on 2 legs, at least 8 feet tall, with a massive frame covered in dark hair or fur. Its eyes reflected his headlights with a greenish glow. For several seconds, David and the creature stared at each other through the rain. Then the thing turned and walked into the forest with a fluid, purposeful movement that was distinctly not human and not like any bear David had ever seen. This time, David was badly shaken. He drove home faster than was safe on the gravel road and went directly to his father. He described what he had seen, expecting skepticism or concern about his mental state. Instead, his father listened quietly and then asked specific questions about the creature's size, its gait, and the location of the sighting. When David finished, his father was silent for a long moment before saying that David should avoid driving that road alone at night for a while. He did not dismiss David's account, but he also did not offer any explanation for what David had seen. David started asking around carefully among people he trusted. He learned that Cripple Creek Road had a reputation among some of the older residents. People claimed to have seen unusual things in that area for decades, though most were reluctant to talk about it openly. One of his teachers, a man who had lived in Haines for 40 years, told David privately that the Tlingit people who were indigenous to the area had stories about certain parts of the forest where humans should not go. Places where things existed that were older and stranger than bears or wolves. The teacher did not say he believed these stories, but he did not dismiss them either. David tried to follow his father's advice and avoid the road at night, but his family lived at the end of that road, and sometimes night driving was unavoidable. Over the next weeks, he saw the creature 3 more times. Each sighting was brief but distinct. The thing seemed to be watching the road, appearing at different locations, but always along the same 3-mile stretch. David noticed that his normally bold and fearless dog, a large husky mix, refused to get out of the truck when they were on that road after dark. The dog would whine and press against David, ears flat, which was completely out of character. David's friend Marcus finally agreed to drive the route with him one evening in early November. Marcus was skeptical of the whole thing and had joked about David's overactive imagination. They drove slowly down Cripple Creek Road just after sunset, both of them watching the forest. For the first 2 miles, nothing happened, and David could feel Marcus's impatience. Then, as they rounded a curve near the 2-mile marker, they both saw it. The creature was standing in the middle of the road, directly in their path. David stopped the truck about 30 yards away. In the headlights, the thing was clearly visible. It was massive, far larger than any bear David had seen, standing fully upright with arms that hung nearly to its knees. Its face was difficult to make out in detail, but David had the impression of something neither fully human nor fully animal. The creature made no sound, did not threaten them, but simply stood there as if asserting its presence. Then, with shocking speed, it moved toward the truck. David threw the vehicle in reverse and backed up rapidly, nearly losing control on the narrow road. When he looked forward again, the creature had vanished into the forest. Marcus was pale and silent. When they reached David's house, Marcus said he needed to go home immediately. He never spoke about what they had seen, and when David tried to bring it up later, Marcus changed the subject. But David noticed that Marcus stopped making jokes about imagination and started taking a different route when he needed to visit David's family. The sightings continued throughout the winter. David saw the creature at least a dozen more times over the next months, always in the same general area, always at night or during the dim light of winter afternoons. Sometimes it was at a distance, moving through the trees parallel to the road. Other times it was closer, standing and watching as David drove past. He developed a routine of driving that stretch as quickly as safety allowed, never stopping, never lingering. His dog's reaction became more extreme, the animal refusing to eat before trips down that road and shaking uncontrollably whenever they approached the area. In February, David came home from basketball practice to find tracks in the snow around his family's property. The tracks were enormous, at least 18 inches long, showing a human-like foot structure but much larger and with visible claw marks. The tracks circled the house, approached the windows, and led to the tree line where they disappeared. David's father photographed the tracks and reported them to Alaska Fish and Game, claiming they were unusual bear tracks. An officer came out and looked at them, but seemed puzzled. He said they did not match any bear tracks he was familiar with, but offered no alternative explanation. That night, David heard something walking around the outside of the house. The footsteps were heavy, deliberate, and stopped directly outside his bedroom window. He could hear breathing, deep and slow, on the other side of the glass. His dog was in the room with him, pressed under the bed, whimpering. David lay frozen, not wanting to look at the window, terrified of what he might see if he did. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the footsteps moved away. In the morning, there were new tracks in the snow, and several large branches had been broken off trees near the house, something that would have required enormous strength. David's parents finally agreed that they needed to take the situation seriously. His father contacted some of the elders in the Tlingit community and asked for advice. They performed a ceremony on the property, though they would not explain to David exactly what it involved or what it was meant to accomplish. They told David's family that they had been living in a place where they were not alone, where something old had territory that included their land, and that respect and caution were necessary. After the ceremony, the direct approaches to the house stopped, but David continued to see the creature on Cripple Creek Road. It was always there, watching, a presence that had claimed that stretch of forest as its own. David graduated from high school that spring and left Haines for college in Anchorage. He was relieved to leave, though he felt guilty about abandoning his parents to that isolated property. His parents eventually sold the land and moved closer to town, though they never explained their decision to relatives who asked. David is now 23 and living in Anchorage, working as a surveyor for a natural resource company. His job sometimes takes him to remote areas, and he has learned to trust his instincts about places that feel wrong, places where the wilderness seems to be watching. He has researched similar sightings across Alaska and the Pacific Northwest, and has found that he is far from alone in his experience. There are hundreds of reports, thousands even, of encounters with creatures that do not fit into accepted categories of wildlife. Most people who have these experiences do not report them publicly because they fear ridicule or disbelief. David's encounter on Cripple Creek Road taught him that the wilderness of Alaska holds things that science has not cataloged. Things that indigenous peoples have known about for thousands of years, but that Western culture dismisses as myth or superstition. He learned that there are boundaries in the natural world that humans cross at their peril, and that the confidence of civilization disappears quickly when faced with something genuinely unknown. He warns anyone who asks that Alaska is not just beautiful and dangerous in the conventional sense of weather and wildlife, but that there are places and things that defy explanation, and that some mysteries are better left alone. Evelyn is currently a licensed bush pilot flying supplies to villages across northern Alaska. She's been flying these routes for 6 years, and she knows the landscape as well as anyone can. The rivers, the mountains, the small clusters of buildings that constitute villages, where a few dozen to a few hundred people make their lives in conditions most Americans cannot imagine. She flies out of Kotzebue, a hub town of about 3,000 people on the coast of the Chukchi Sea, and her routes take her to places like Noatak, Kiana, Selawik, and dozens of smaller settlements. She flies mail, medicine, food, fuel, and occasionally passengers. Her Cessna 206 is equipped with both wheels and skis, allowing her to land on gravel strips in summer and frozen lakes in winter. The work is demanding and dangerous, with weather that can turn deadly in minutes, but Evelyn loves it. She feels most alive when she is alone in her plane, navigating by landmarks and instinct, bringing supplies that people depend on for survival. In March of 2023, something happened that Evelyn still cannot explain. She was flying her regular route from Kotzebue to Noatak, a village of about 500 people roughly 50 miles inland. The weather was clear with good visibility, which was a blessing in late winter when storms could strand villages for days. She had flown this route hundreds of times and could navigate it in her sleep. Her radio was tuned to the standard aviation frequency, monitoring traffic and weather reports. About halfway to Noatak, she heard something unusual on the radio. A voice, distorted by static but clearly human, was calling for help. The transmission was weak and intermittent, but Evelyn could make out enough to understand that someone was in distress. The voice was male, panicked, and speaking English with what sounded like a mid-century accent. He was saying that his plane had gone down, that he was injured, that he needed rescue immediately. He provided coordinates, which Evelyn quickly wrote down on her kneeboard. The coordinates placed the crash site about 20 miles north of her current position, in an area of tundra and small lakes. Evelyn tried to respond, asking for more information, asking the pilot to repeat his location and describe his condition. But her transmissions seemed to go unheard. The distressed pilot continued calling for help, repeating the same information, as if he could not hear anyone trying to reach him. Evelyn made a decision. She diverted from her route and headed toward the coordinates. If someone had crashed and survived, time would be critical. In the March cold, exposure could kill in hours. She climbed to get a better view of the terrain and scanned for any sign of a downed aircraft. The coordinates led her to a series of small frozen lakes surrounded by low hills. She circled the area multiple times, flying low and slow, looking for wreckage, for any disturbance in the snow, for smoke or any sign of human presence. She saw nothing. The landscape was pristine and empty, showing no evidence of a crash. She tried again to contact the distressed pilot, but now the transmission had stopped entirely. Her radio was silent except for the normal traffic from other pilots and air traffic control. Evelyn expanded her search pattern, thinking perhaps the pilot's coordinates had been inaccurate due to stress or injury. She spent an additional 30 minutes searching before her fuel reserves forced her to continue to Noatak. She reported the incident to authorities as soon as she landed, providing the coordinates and describing what she had heard. Alaska state troopers and the Civil Air Patrol were notified, and a search was organized. The search found nothing. No crash site, no wreckage, no emergency locator beacon signal, no tracks, no evidence that any aircraft had been in that area recently. Evelyn was interviewed extensively, and she provided all the details she could remember. The authorities checked records of missing aircraft and found no reports matching the time frame or location. They suggested that Evelyn might have heard an old recording somehow transmitted, or that atmospheric conditions had caused her to receive a transmission from far away, or that equipment malfunction had created the sound she interpreted as a distress call. Evelyn listened to their explanations, but did not find them convincing. She knew what she had heard, and it had been a real person in real distress. A week later, Evelyn heard the transmission again. She was flying a different route, heading east toward Bettles, when the same voice came over her radio. The same panicked tone, the same plea for help, the same coordinates. This time, Evelyn recognized immediately that it was identical to the first transmission, word for word, inflection for inflection. It was as if the same moment in time was repeating. She recorded the transmission on her phone, holding it near the radio speaker. When it ended, she again tried to respond, and again received no acknowledgement. She was closer to the coordinates this time, only about 15 miles away, and she diverted to investigate. Once again, she found nothing. Over the next months, Evelyn heard the transmission 7 more times. It always occurred when she was flying in the northern region, always within a 50-mile radius of the original coordinates. Other pilots began reporting the same phenomenon. At least 5 other bush pilots came forward to say they had heard the distress call and had either searched for the source or reported it to authorities. None had found anything. The transmissions always contained the same message, always provided the same coordinates, and always cut off after about 2 minutes. Evelyn became obsessed with understanding what was happening. She researched the history of aviation accidents in the region and discovered something disturbing. In January of 1952, a bush pilot named Robert McKinley disappeared while flying from Kotzebue to Noatak. His plane, a Piper Super Cub, was never found despite extensive searches. McKinley had been an experienced pilot, well-liked in the community, and his disappearance had been a major tragedy. Records from the search indicated that searchers had focused on an area roughly 20 miles north of the route, near a series of small lakes. The description matched the coordinates from the distress transmission. Evelyn obtained a photograph of McKinley from historical archives and showed it to an elderly man in Kotzebue who had known him. The man described McKinley's voice and manner of speaking. When Evelyn played her recording of the distress transmission, the man went pale. He said it sounded exactly like McKinley, down to specific phrases and the slight accent that indicated McKinley had grown up in the Midwest before coming to Alaska. But this seemed impossible. Radio equipment from 1952 could not still be transmitting. And even if it could, why would it broadcast the same message repeatedly over 7 decades? Evelyn submitted her recordings to the Federal Aviation Administration and to researchers at the University of Alaska who studied atmospheric phenomena. The FAA acknowledged receiving her report, but offered no explanation beyond suggesting equipment malfunction or unusual signal propagation. the university researchers were more interested and conducted their own investigation. They confirmed that multiple pilots had reported the same phenomenon, and that the transmissions were real, not hallucinations or equipment failure. But they could not explain the source or mechanism. One researcher suggested that certain atmospheric conditions in the Arctic might create a kind of electromagnetic recording that could replay under specific circumstances. But this was purely theoretical and had no scientific basis. The story began to spread through the small world of Alaska bush pilots. Some dismissed it as a ghost story, others as a hoax. But many took it seriously because they knew the pilots who had heard the transmissions and trusted their professionalism. Evelyn found herself at the center of something that made her deeply uncomfortable. She was a practical person, trained in the hard realities of aviation and wilderness survival. She did not believe in the supernatural, but she also could not deny what she and others had experienced. In August of 2024, a group of researchers and volunteers conducted a ground search of the area around the coordinates. They used metal detectors, ground-penetrating radar, and drones equipped with cameras. They searched for 2 weeks in difficult terrain. On the 13th day, they found wreckage. It was buried in a depression between 2 hills, covered by decades of vegetation and soil accumulation. The wreckage was from a Piper Super Cub, and the tail number matched Robert McKinley's missing aircraft. Human remains were found in the cockpit, along with a radio that had been keyed in the transmit position as if McKinley had been calling for help when he died. The discovery provided some answers, but raised more questions. The radio had been transmitting when the crash occurred in 1952. But standard radio equipment cannot broadcast for decades without power. The plane's battery would have died within days or weeks at most. Yet multiple pilots had heard transmissions that seemed to originate from that location, transmissions that matched McKinley's voice and included accurate coordinates for the crash site. Experts who examined the wreckage could not explain how the radio could have continued functioning or how the signal could have persisted for over 70 years. Evelyn attended McKinley's burial service in Kotzebue, where his remains were finally laid to rest after 7 decades. The community honored him as one of the pioneering bush pilots who had built Alaska's aviation network. Evelyn felt a sense of closure, though the mystery of the transmissions remained unsolved. She continued to fly her routes, and occasionally she still heard the distress call on her radio. But after McKinley's burial, the transmissions became less frequent. Other pilots reported the same pattern. It was as if McKinley's message had finally been received, his location found, and his story completed. Evelyn does not claim to understand what happened. She knows that there are phenomena in the world that science cannot yet explain, and that Alaska, with its vast distances and extreme conditions, seems to generate more than its share of such mysteries. She knows that the radio transmissions were real, that they led to the discovery of McKinley's crash site, and that multiple witnesses corroborated every aspect of the story. She has stopped trying to convince skeptics and instead focuses on her work, flying supplies to remote villages and watching the landscape for anything unusual. She has learned that the wilderness keeps its secrets carefully, revealing them only when and how it chooses, and that sometimes the boundary between the explicable and the impossible is thinner than anyone wants to believe. Joseph was a 32-year-old teacher who had moved to Alaska 4 years before this incident. He had taken a position in a predominantly native village where he was one of only 3 non-native residents. The village, which he would later decline to name publicly out of respect for the community, had a population of about 150 people and was located in the interior, accessible only by boat in summer and snow machine or small plane in winter. Joseph had grown up in suburban Massachusetts and had studied education at the University of Vermont. He had come to Alaska seeking purpose and adventure, wanting to make a difference in a place where good teachers were desperately needed. The first years had been challenging but rewarding. He learned to live without running water in winter, to split wood for heat, to navigate the complex social dynamics of a small community where everyone was related by blood or marriage. Joseph had worked hard to earn the trust of the village. He respected the culture, attended community gatherings, learned basic phrases in the local Athabascan language, and most importantly, he listened. The elders began to accept him, sharing stories and teachings that outsiders rarely heard. Joseph felt privileged to be included, to witness traditions that stretched back thousands of years. He taught English, math, and science to students ranging from kindergarten through 8th grade, and he loved the work despite the difficulties. The school was small, resources were limited, and many students struggled with issues stemming from poverty and historical trauma. But Joseph believed he was making a difference, that his presence mattered. In his 3rd year, Joseph developed a friendship with an elder named Daniel, a man in his 70s who had lived his entire life in the village and knew the land and its history intimately. Daniel was a respected storyteller and keeper of traditional knowledge. He invited Joseph to his home for tea and conversation, and over time he began to share stories about the old ways, about how the people had lived before contact with Europeans, about their relationship with the land and the spirits that inhabited it. Joseph listened with genuine interest and respect, taking notes when Daniel allowed it, asking thoughtful questions. Daniel seemed pleased to have an audience who took his knowledge seriously, and the two men developed a bond that transcended their cultural differences. Daniel told Joseph about the woodsmen, entities that lived in the forests and could take various forms. He explained that the land was not empty wilderness, but was inhabited by beings that had their own territories and rules. Humans could coexist with these beings, Daniel said, but only if they showed proper respect and observed certain boundaries. There were places where humans should not go, times when the forest should be left alone, protocols for hunting and fishing that were not just practical, but spiritual. Joseph found these stories fascinating from an anthropological perspective, though he did not actually believe in the existence of supernatural entities. He thought of them as cultural metaphors, ways of encoding practical survival knowledge and environmental ethics in narrative form. Daniel seemed to sense Joseph's skepticism, but did not challenge it directly. Instead, he told Joseph about specific locations around the village that should be avoided, particularly after dark. He described signs that indicated the presence of something dangerous, changes in animal behavior or unusual sounds, or feelings of being watched. He explained that the darkness between houses, the spaces that were neither fully wild nor fully domesticated, were particularly active places where boundaries blurred and encounters could occur. Joseph thanked Daniel for the information and promised to be respectful. But privately, he thought the warnings were based on superstition and fear of the dark, rather than any real danger. In October of his 4th year, Joseph made a mistake. There was a trail that led from the village to a fishing spot on the river, about 2 miles through forest. The trail passed through an area that Daniel had specifically warned Joseph to avoid after sunset. But Joseph needed exercise and solitude, and the trail was the best place for an evening run. He had run it dozens of times during the summer without incident, and he saw no reason to stop just because the nights were getting longer. He dismissed Daniel's warning as the kind of superstition that he, as an educated person, should not indulge. On a Friday evening in late October, Joseph went for his run. It was already dark by 5 in the afternoon, and the temperature was dropping below freezing. Joseph wore a headlamp and reflective clothing. He started down the trail at his usual pace, enjoying the physical exertion and the quiet of the forest. The trail was familiar, and he could have run it with his eyes closed. About halfway to the river, in the section that Daniel had warned against, Joseph began to feel uneasy. It was subtle at first, just a sense that something was not quite right. The forest seemed too quiet. There were no sounds of animals or wind, just an oppressive silence that pressed in around the narrow beam of his headlamp. Joseph slowed to a walk, telling himself he was being irrational. There was nothing to fear. This was just woods, just trees and darkness, nothing more. But the feeling intensified. He felt watched, assessed, as if something in the darkness was paying very close attention to him. His rational mind insisted there was no threat, but his body reacted with primal fear. Adrenaline flooding his system, his heart rate increasing beyond what the exercise could account for. He stopped completely and turned in a circle, his headlamp beam cutting through the darkness. He saw nothing unusual, just trees and snow. But the feeling of presence was overwhelming. Then he heard a sound. It was not a sound he could identify with any animal he knew. It was a kind of clicking or knocking, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from multiple directions. Joseph tried to pinpoint the source, but the sound seemed to move, surrounding him. He made a decision to run back to the village, abandoning his workout. As he turned to retreat, he saw something at the edge of his headlamp beam. A figure, tall and thin, standing between trees. It was there for only a fraction of a second before melting back into darkness. But Joseph had seen enough to know it was not human. The proportions were wrong, the movement too fluid, the way it vanished too complete. Joseph ran. He ran faster than he had ever run in his life, his headlamp bouncing wildly, his breath coming in gasps. He felt pursued, though he did not look back to confirm it. The clicking sounds followed him, sometimes close, sometimes distant, always maintaining a presence. He reached the edge of the village and did not stop until he was inside his small house with the door locked. He stood in his kitchen, shaking, trying to convince himself that he had panicked over nothing, that darkness and isolation had triggered an anxiety response, that there was a rational explanation for everything he had experienced. But over the next days, strange things began to happen in Joseph's house. Small items would be moved or rearranged. He would place his keys on the table and find them on a windowsill. He would organize papers on his desk and return to find them scattered. His dog, a calm and friendly husky mix, began acting strangely, refusing to enter certain rooms, whining at windows, waking Joseph in the night with low growls directed at empty corners. Joseph tried to rationalize these occurrences. Perhaps he was more forgetful than he realized. Perhaps the dog was reacting to sounds or smells that Joseph could not detect. But he could not shake the feeling that something was in his house, something that should not be there. He also began to feel watched inside his home, the same oppressive sense of presence he had experienced on the trail. At night, he would lie awake, listening to sounds that might have been the house settling or might have been something moving through rooms. He felt like he was losing his mind, like the isolation and darkness were eroding his sanity. He considered leaving, flying out to Fairbanks for a break. But he did not want to abandon his students or admit that he could not handle life in the village. Daniel noticed that something was wrong. He asked Joseph if everything was okay, and Joseph, desperate for help, told him what had happened on the trail and what had been occurring in his house. Daniel's expression grew grave. He said that Joseph had ignored the warnings and had shown disrespect by entering that area without proper preparation or permission. He explained that what Joseph had encountered on the trail had followed him home, that the boundary between Joseph's space and its space had been violated, and that now there was an imbalance that needed to be corrected. Daniel spoke with other elders, and they agreed to help Joseph. They would not explain to him exactly what they were going to do, saying only that it was traditional knowledge that outsiders should not possess. They came to Joseph's house on a Saturday morning, 3 elders including Daniel, and they spent several hours there. Joseph was asked to wait outside. He sat on his porch in the cold November air, wondering what was happening inside his home. He could hear singing or chanting, could smell smoke that was not from his wood stove, could sense activity that he was not privy to. When the elders emerged, Daniel told Joseph that they had addressed the situation, that they had shown proper respect and asked for the imbalance to be corrected. He said that Joseph must also show respect by observing certain rules. He must not run that trail after dark ever again. He must leave offerings at specific locations around the village. He must acknowledge verbally that he shares the land with beings beyond his understanding. Joseph, humbled and frightened, agreed to everything. That night, Joseph experienced something that would fundamentally change his worldview. He woke around 3 in the morning to find his room filled with a presence so powerful and undeniable that his skepticism shattered completely. He could not see anything clearly in the darkness, but he knew with absolute certainty that he was not alone, that something was in the room with him, something aware and intelligent. He felt no threat, but he felt judgment, assessment, a sense of being measured. Then he heard a voice, not in his ears but in his mind, speaking words he could not fully comprehend, but which conveyed a message. He was being allowed to stay, but only if he remembered that he was a guest, that the land was not his, that there were rules older than human civilization, and that respect was not optional, but necessary for survival. The presence faded, and Joseph lay in his bed until dawn, too shaken to move. When morning came, he noticed that the oppressive feeling in his house was gone. The dog was calm, sleeping peacefully. The air felt normal, unremarkable, as if nothing unusual had ever occurred. But Joseph was changed. He went to Daniel's house and thanked him with tears in his eyes, admitting that he had not truly believed and apologizing for his arrogance. Daniel accepted the apology and told Joseph that most outsiders went their whole lives without truly understanding, that Joseph should consider himself fortunate to have learned before he was seriously harmed. Joseph still teaches in the village, now in his 8th year there. He has become more integrated into the community, more humble in his approach, more willing to accept that his education and scientific worldview do not encompass all of reality. He observes the rules the elders taught him, leaves offerings as instructed, and never runs that trail after dark. He has not had another direct encounter with the presence from the forest, but he knows it is there, always, in the darkness between houses and in the wild spaces beyond the village. His students sometimes ask him if he believes the old stories, and he tells them honestly that he does, that he has learned there are more things in the world than any university taught him, and that the wisdom of the elders is earned through generations of experience living in relationship with a land that demands respect. The experience fundamentally changed who Joseph was and what he believed about reality, teaching him that dismissing traditional knowledge as superstition was not enlightenment, but ignorance, and that true education required humility in the face of mysteries that science could not yet explain. Scarlett recently came across information about someone from her past that left her completely shaken. She figured she would document this to process what happened and to warn others about how danger can hide in plain sight, wearing the most ordinary faces. But before starting, Scarlett is currently 29 years old and works as a historical researcher specializing in oral histories of rural communities. She wants to apologize if this account seems too focused on details rather than emotions. But clinical documentation is her defense mechanism against trauma. This story mentions murder, though she will not go into graphic details out of respect for the victims and their families. Please understand that what follows is true, verified through public records and news reports, and far more disturbing than any fiction she could imagine. When Scarlett was 24, she moved to a small coastal Alaskan town to conduct graduate research for her master's degree in anthropology. The town, which she will call Seldovia for the purposes of this account, though that is not its real name, had a population of roughly 250 people and was accessible only by boat or plane. Scarlett's research focused on documenting the oral histories of fishing families who had lived in the area for multiple generations. She was interested in how these communities adapted to the dramatic changes in the fishing industry over the past century, how they maintained cultural identity in the face of economic pressures and depopulation, and how their knowledge of the marine environment was passed between generations. Scarlett rented a small apartment above the general store and spent her days interviewing longtime residents, recording their stories, and organizing the material into her thesis. The community was initially wary of her, as rural Alaskans often are with outsiders who ask too many questions. But over time, people began to trust her. She was respectful. She listened carefully. She did not sensationalize or romanticize their lives. And she genuinely cared about preserving their stories. She attended community gatherings, helped with the Salmon Bake fundraiser, and made herself useful in small ways that demonstrated commitment rather than just extracting information for academic purposes. One of the families Scarlett grew closest to was the Andersons. Tom Anderson was in his 60s, a retired fisherman who had worked the waters around Seldovia his entire life. His wife Sarah was a few years younger and had grown up in Anchorage, but had lived in Seldovia since marrying Tom 40 years earlier. They had 3 adult children who had all moved away for work but visited regularly. The Andersons were warm and welcoming, inviting Scarlett to their home for dinners and holiday gatherings. Tom had an encyclopedic knowledge of local history and was a natural storyteller, making him an ideal subject for Scarlett's research. Over the 2 years of her fieldwork, Scarlett recorded over 30 hours of interviews with Tom, covering everything from fishing techniques to family histories to environmental changes he had witnessed over decades. Sarah was equally generous, sharing family photographs and documents that provided context for Tom's stories. Their home was filled with artifacts of a life lived in connection with the sea, fishing nets and tools, photographs of boats and catches, family mementos spanning generations. Scarlett felt privileged to be welcomed into their lives and considered the Andersons not just research subjects, but friends. They treated her like a member of the family, checking on her during storms, inviting her on boat trips, including her in private family events. Scarlett had been estranged from her own family due to conflicts over her career choices, and the Andersons filled a void she had not realized was so deep. During the Christmas of Scarlett's second year in Seldovia, the Andersons hosted a gathering at their home. Their children and grandchildren were visiting, along with extended family and friends. Scarlett was invited and felt honored to be included in such an intimate family occasion. It was at this gathering that she met Tom's brother, a man named Raymond, who lived in a remote cabin about 15 miles up the coast. Raymond was in his late 50s, tall and weathered, with the kind of silence that comes from living alone in the wilderness. He made irregular visits to town for supplies, but was largely a hermit, existing on the margins of the community. Tom introduced Scarlett to Raymond with obvious affection, explaining that his brother had chosen a solitary life but was a skilled hunter and fisherman who lived entirely off the land. Raymond shook Scarlett's hand with a grip that was firm but not aggressive, and they exchanged pleasantries. Scarlett asked if she could interview him sometime about his subsistence lifestyle, thinking his perspective would add depth to her research. Raymond seemed flattered by the interest and said she was welcome to visit his cabin any time, that Tom could bring her out by boat when weather permitted. The rest of the evening passed pleasantly, with Raymond contributing occasional comments to conversations, but mostly observing quietly from the periphery. Over the next months, Scarlett did visit Raymond's cabin twice, accompanied by Tom. The cabin was primitive but functional, sitting on a rocky beach with a stunning view of the mountains across the water. Raymond showed her his smokehouse, his food cache elevated on posts to keep it safe from bears, his garden where he grew vegetables during the short summer. He explained his routines and his relationship with the land in simple, direct language. Scarlett recorded these conversations and found them valuable additions to her research. Raymond seemed like a man who had rejected modern complexity in favor of self-reliance and solitude. There was nothing in his demeanor or his environment that struck Scarlett as threatening or unusual beyond his chosen isolation. Scarlett completed her fieldwork in the spring and defended her thesis that summer. She graduated and took a position with a museum in Seattle, moving back to the lower 48 and transitioning to a new phase of her career. She stayed in touch with the Andersons through occasional emails and phone calls, but the intensity of their relationship naturally diminished with distance. She thought of her time in Seldovia fondly, as a period of growth and discovery, as the beginning of her professional life. She had no reason to think about Raymond specifically, as he had been a minor character in her larger research narrative. 4 years passed. Scarlett was 28 and established in her museum work, curating exhibits and continuing to conduct oral history projects in various communities. One morning, she received an email from a fellow anthropologist who had heard about Scarlett's work in Seldovia. The colleague had sent her a link to a news article with a brief message asking if Scarlett had known the man mentioned in the story. Scarlett opened the link and felt her stomach drop as she read the headline. Raymond Anderson had been arrested for the murder of 2 women whose remains had been discovered on his remote property. The article provided details that made Scarlett's hands shake. Alaska State Troopers had received a tip from a pilot who had seen suspicious disturbances on Raymond's property while flying over the area. A search warrant was executed, and investigators discovered human remains buried in various locations around the cabin. Forensic analysis identified the remains as belonging to 2 women who had been reported missing years earlier, one from Anchorage and one from a village on the Kenai Peninsula. Both women had been hitchhiking or traveling alone when they disappeared. Evidence suggested they had been held captive for periods of time before being killed. Raymond was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Scarlett sat in her office, reading and rereading the article, trying to reconcile the man she had met with the monster described in the news. She had been alone with Raymond, had sat in his cabin recording his voice, had walked around his property while he showed her his subsistence systems. She remembered his hands, the same hands that had shaken hers and had apparently committed unspeakable acts of violence. She thought about Tom and Sarah, about the shock and horror they must be experiencing, about how their family was being torn apart by this revelation. She wanted to reach out to them, but did not know what to say, could not imagine what words would be adequate. The trial occurred the following year. Scarlett followed the news coverage obsessively, learning details she wished she could unlearn. Raymond had lured both women to his cabin under pretenses of offering help or work. The isolation of his location meant that no one heard their screams, that their deaths were slow and cruel, that Raymond had lived with their bodies buried around his property for years without showing any outward signs of guilt. He eventually pled guilty to 2 counts of manslaughter as part of a plea bargain, claiming the deaths were not premeditated, but resulted from situations that escalated beyond his control. The families of the victims protested the reduced charges, but the prosecution accepted the plea to avoid the trauma of a trial. Raymond was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Scarlett attended the sentencing via video conference, watching as Raymond stood before the judge. He looked older, diminished, no longer the self-sufficient hermit, but a shrunken figure in prison clothing. He made a brief statement, apologizing to the families, but offering no real explanation for his actions. Scarlett felt a complicated mix of emotions: anger at Raymond, grief for the victims, guilt over her own inability to see the signs that must have been present, and deep sadness for Tom and Sarah, who had lost their brother to a moral abyss they never suspected existed. In 2024, Scarlett learned through news reports that Raymond had been released early due to prison overcrowding and good behavior. He had served only 15 years of his sentence. Within 3 months of his release, another woman disappeared from a remote area of Alaska. Her body was discovered 6 weeks later, and evidence linked Raymond to her death. He was arrested again and charged with second-degree murder. This time there would be no plea bargain. The prosecution was determined to ensure Raymond would never be released again. Scarlett cannot stop thinking about the victims. She researched their lives and found that they were ordinary women trying to navigate challenging circumstances. One had been a mother escaping an abusive relationship. The other had been a college student working seasonal jobs to pay for school. They had trusted Raymond's offers of help because he seemed like a kind, older man living a simple life. Their trust had been betrayed in the most brutal way imaginable. Scarlett wondered how many other women Raymond had approached who had declined his offers or who had escaped by luck rather than judgment. She also thinks constantly about her own vulnerability. She had been alone with Raymond multiple times in a location where no one could have helped her if he had decided to harm her. She had trusted him because Tom trusted him, because he seemed gentle and harmless, because she could not imagine that someone capable of such evil could maintain such a convincing facade. She wonders what would have happened if she had been alone in her car and Raymond had offered her help with a flat tire, or if she had been hiking and gotten lost and stumbled upon his cabin. Would she have become another set of remains buried in the woods? The experience has changed how Scarlett sees the world and how she conducts her research. She is more cautious now, more aware that danger can wear any face, that isolation and trust can be weaponized by predators, that the wilderness of Alaska provides perfect cover for those who prey on the vulnerable. She has tried to contact Tom and Sarah, but has received no response, and she understands their need for distance. The last she heard, they had left Seldovia, unable to remain in a place now associated with such horror. Scarlett continues her work documenting oral histories and preserving cultural knowledge. But she carries with her the knowledge that she met evil wearing the mask of ordinariness, that she sat across from a killer and saw nothing but a quiet man living close to the land. She learned that some people are very skilled at hiding their true nature, that charisma and trust can be tools of manipulation, and that she cannot allow herself to forget the women who were not as fortunate as she was to leave Raymond's cabin alive. This happened to Owen when he was around 19 years old. Owen, now 24, used to be more trusting as a younger person attending a satellite campus of the University of Alaska in a town of 600 people. The campus was part of a system that brought higher education to remote communities offering associate degrees and certificate programs to students who could not afford to relocate to Anchorage or Fairbanks. Owen was studying natural resource management, planning to work for the Forest Service or the Bureau of Land Management after graduation. He loved the small campus environment where everyone knew each other, and classes felt more like discussions than lectures. The program was tight-knit by necessity, with only about 40 students total and maybe a dozen in Owen's cohort. They studied together, socialized together, and looked out for one another in a way that felt more like family than institutional education. Owen described his small college program and the tight-knit group of classmates who had all started together the previous year. Most were from Alaska, with a few from the lower 48 states seeking adventure and a different kind of college experience. They spent long hours in the field together, learning survey techniques, plant identification, wildlife management protocols, and wilderness first aid. The instructors were professionals who had spent decades working in Alaska and taught practical skills as much as theory. Owen loved the work and felt he had found his path in life. His friend group consisted of about 6 people who did everything together, studying in the small library, grabbing meals at the only restaurant in town, and taking weekend trips into the backcountry. In January of Owen's second year, a new student transferred into the program. His name was Carter, and he said he had been attending the Anchorage campus, but wanted a smaller, more personal learning environment. This was not unusual, as students did sometimes transfer between campuses, though it was more common to go from small to large, rather than the reverse. Carter seemed eager to fit in, asking questions about the program, expressing enthusiasm for the coursework, and seeking out social connections with his new classmates. He was about Owen's age, maybe slightly older, with an easy smile and a friendly demeanor that made people feel comfortable around him. Carter inserted himself into Owen's life with remarkable speed. Within days of arriving, he was sitting with Owen's friend group at meals, joining their study sessions, and tagging along on their activities. Owen thought nothing of this initially, assuming Carter was simply trying to integrate into the community quickly. But over the following weeks, Owen began to notice that Carter seemed particularly focused on him specifically, sitting next to him in classes, seeking him out for one-on-one conversations, and displaying knowledge about Owen's schedule and habits that seemed oddly detailed. Carter would mention things about Owen's routine that Owen did not remember sharing, like where Owen usually went for morning coffee or what time he typically finished his homework in the evenings. In February, the program organized a weekend field research trip to study winter ecology in a remote area about 30 miles from campus. Students worked in pairs, and Carter immediately partnered with Owen before Owen could pair up with his usual friends. They would be camping in the wilderness, collecting data on snow depths, animal tracks, and vegetation distribution. Owen felt mildly uncomfortable with the pairing, but did not want to seem unfriendly, so he agreed. During the planning meetings, Carter repeatedly suggested that he and Owen should go to areas farther from the main group, claiming the data would be more valuable from less studied locations. The instructors overruled these suggestions, emphasizing the importance of buddy system safety and keeping pairs within communication range of each other. The week before the field trip, Owen discovered something disturbing. He was working in the computer lab on campus late one evening when he needed to log into his student account from a different computer than he usually used. When he sat down, he noticed that someone had recently accessed the student information system and had not logged out properly. The screen showed student records, including personal information like addresses, phone numbers, and emergency contacts. Owen realized with shock that his own record was open on the screen. He looked at the browsing history and saw that Carter's account had been used to access not just Owen's information, but records for several other students as well. Owen reported this to the campus IT administrator the next morning, explaining what he had found. The administrator confirmed that Carter had accessed student records he should not have had permission to view. When confronted, Carter claimed he had been trying to create a student directory as a community building project and had mistakenly used administrator credentials he had found written on a note. He apologized profusely and said he would delete all the information he had collected. The administrator was skeptical, but had limited options in such a small campus environment. Carter was given a warning and told that any further violations would result in suspension. Owen asked Carter directly to explain why he had accessed Owen's personal information specifically. Carter became defensive, claiming it was random, that he had been looking at many student records for his directory project. But Owen had seen the screen, had seen his own name prominently displayed, and did not believe the explanation. He told Carter that he felt uncomfortable with the behavior and wanted some distance. Carter's friendly demeanor evaporated, replaced by a coldness that surprised Owen. Carter said that Owen was overreacting, that they were friends, and that Owen should be grateful, that someone was making an effort to include him in things. The implication seemed to be that Owen had no right to set boundaries. The field research trip proceeded as scheduled, but Owen managed to switch partners at the last minute, claiming he needed to work with a student who had complementary skills for his research project. Carter was clearly angry about this, refusing to speak to Owen for the rest of the weekend. Other students noticed the tension and asked Owen what had happened. When Owen explained about the accessed records and Carter's strange focus on him, one of his friends made a startling revelation. None of them had known Carter before he showed up at their table claiming to be a new transfer student. They had assumed someone in the group had invited him or that another student had introduced him. But when they compared notes, they realized that Carter had simply appeared one day and inserted himself into their friend group with no actual connection to any of them. Owen went to the program director and requested information about Carter's transfer. The director reviewed the records and confirmed that Carter had transferred from the Anchorage campus. But when they called the Anchorage campus to request his transcripts, they discovered inconsistencies. Carter had been enrolled in Anchorage, but had been asked to leave the program due to behavioral issues involving inappropriate focus on another student. The Anchorage campus had not communicated this to the satellite campus when processing the transfer, a failure of administrative communication that put Owen at risk. The program director called Carter in for a meeting and informed him that his enrollment was being reviewed. Carter became agitated, accusing Owen of sabotaging him, claiming that Owen was jealous of Carter's abilities, insisting that he had every right to be in the program. The meeting ended with Carter being placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation. He was barred from campus and told to return to Anchorage. But Carter did not leave town. Over the next week, Owen began seeing him around the small community. Carter would be standing outside the library when Owen left. He would be at the coffee shop when Owen arrived in the morning. One night, Owen saw him standing in the parking lot outside Owen's apartment building, just watching the windows. Owen called campus security, which in a town of 600 people meant calling the only police officer who covered the entire area. The officer spoke with Carter and told him to leave Owen alone, but there were limited legal options without an overt threat or physical contact. Owen's friends rallied around him, making sure he was never alone, walking him to and from classes, staying with him at his apartment. They discovered that Carter had been researching the backcountry areas where their program conducted fieldwork, focusing on remote locations where students often went in small groups. The tower implication was chilling. If Carter had succeeded in getting Owen alone in a remote wilderness location, there would have been ample opportunity for something terrible to happen, and the isolation would have made it easy to claim an accident. One of the instructors, a man who had worked in Alaska for 30 years and had a background in law enforcement, took the situation seriously. He contacted the Alaska State Troopers and provided them with all the information about Carter's behavior, his access of student records, his focus on Owen, and his refusal to leave town after being dismissed from the program. The trooper investigated and discovered that Carter had a history of similar behavior at 3 other institutions in Alaska and Washington state. He would enroll in programs with small, tight-knit communities, fixate on a particular student, gain access to their personal information, and attempt to engineer situations where he could isolate them. He had never been convicted of any crime, but he had been repeatedly asked to leave programs and had restraining orders filed against him by 2 previous targets. The trooper obtained a restraining order on Owen's behalf and made it clear to Carter that any further contact would result in arrest. Carter finally left the area, and Owen learned later that he had been committed to a psychiatric facility after making threats against staff at his next destination. The experience left Owen shaken and suspicious, no longer the trusting person he had been. He completed his degree, but transferred to the Fairbanks campus for his final year, unable to feel safe in the small town where Carter had stalked him. Owen is now 24 and working as a surveyor for a natural resource company based in Anchorage. His job takes him to remote areas across Alaska, and he has become hypervigilant about safety and awareness. He researches every person he works with, maintains strict boundaries with acquaintances, and never allows himself to be alone with someone he does not know well in an isolated location. He has learned that small communities, while generally safe and supportive, can also become traps when someone predatory enters them. The trust that binds people together in harsh environments can be exploited by those who understand how to mimic trustworthiness. Owen has tried to warn other students about the patterns Carter exhibited, sharing his story through online forums and safety workshops, hoping others will recognize the warning signs before finding themselves in danger. He learned that predators are not always strangers in dark alleys, but can be people who seem normal and friendly, who know how to insert themselves into communities, who study their targets carefully, and who use isolation as a weapon. He blocked the email accounts Carter created years later, trying to re-establish contact, and he has accepted that he will never feel entirely safe in remote places. That a part of him will always be scanning for threats, always aware that danger can come from unexpected sources in places where help is far away.